welcome to this week's episode of Food Bites. Cheryl Forchuk is an old friend, but also, Cheryl, I was just counting, this is your fifth time on this show in the last year. And it's not because I'm desperate for guests, it's because the knowledge that you have is so unique and so in-depth and so pan-national, if I can use that term. I wanted to congratulate you too, because I saw again that you won the 2023 Scientists of the Year Award for the Lawson Impact Awards. I mean, that must have been quite an honor. You're so close to Lawson, right? Yeah. And you also have, as I said before, you're a member of the Order of Canada. If I were to list all, that's right, Order of Ontario, correct. If I was to list all of the things that you did, that would take up this 30-minute show. So that's not going to work here. But I do remember you telling me twice before, Glen, above all, I'm always a nurse. Yes. Correct. So that's important. I did want to talk to you about homelessness. I know a couple of things. One is the health and homeless thing that's going on in London, which involves so many institutions and others, to try to help folks that are the most affected by homelessness is going on. But one of the things I have realized about that is now that is going on, there's a large kind of silence, a vacuum that's taking place in the city about homelessness. There's not a lot of talking about it out in this public sphere. I realize there's a lot going on behind it. So I'd be interested in your view of that. And the second thing, I wanted to talk to you because you've recently produced a paper in collaboration with some others about homeless people and how they suffer through dementia. I was really taken by that because I go out fairly often handing out homeless lunches as part of the food bank homeless lunch program. And after I read the things that you had written, I realized, yes, I've seen some of that. So I think it's really in time for us to unpack that, because I think it's new. I think it's very evocative in its own way. But I wanted to provide an opportunity for you to go through that. I know sometimes it wasn't easy for you to get that paper accepted or people to even believe it. But maybe you can just start and take us through, Cheryl, and I'll stop you every once in a while to just ask a question or two. But take us through it. How did it start? How did it get going?
Yeah, and again, research is a team sport. I always remind you that I'm a nurse, but also that I work in teams. And in particular, Richard Booth really led this paper. He's the co-PI on our homelessness counts project. So he's been doing a lot of the quantitative work with the qualitative that I'm doing, like the stories and the numbers, basically. But they really inform each other. And we both do some work with both. Also, Salima Sharif from ICES here in London, and Amanda Poe does Gupta. He has an expertise in dementia, including Alzheimer's, and we thought that these different perspectives were really interesting to pull together. So one of the things I found, we've talked previously that with our homelessness count study, we went to 28 communities across the country, including London, every province and territory. We interviewed 400 people experiencing homelessness, as well as doing focus groups. But one of the things I was finding, and I personally went to every province and territory, and I would always have at least one, sometimes a couple staff members. I was noticing people with dementia on the street, and it was concerning. And there were a few situations that really put it to mind. And in my conversations with people providing services across the country, they also were identifying that, yes, this is something they're starting to see, but they're in no position to actually assess it. Sometimes if someone's confused, you don't know why they're confused. If someone's having memory problems, you don't know why they're having memory problems. But it was certainly confirmatory. And we can circle back at one point. I could tell you a couple of exemplar situations that really had me concerned about this. And with our funder from Public Health Agency of Canada, they also had a dementia stream there. And when we looked at the literature, we realized hardly anyone's actually looked at this issue. Most of it was either qualitative or very small samples. The closest thing we found to more of a population base was basically the equivalent of Veterans Affairs in the US. So that's a very specific population. Other than that, it's just something that people haven't looked at. I think people don't even want to contemplate what that would be like to be homeless and have dementia. Anyway, with our algorithm, and as I say, Richard really did a tremendous amount of work because, as mentioned, the feedback, we had it published in Lancet Public Health, so a very top tier journal. Instead of the usual couple of reviewers, it was like 5 reviewers, and you had to convince all of them. And at times, I think people, one reviewer, there's always one, the reviewer two, we always call it. For some reason, they always end up being the second one on the list. Couldn't believe it. Thought we must have a biased sample or whatever. And our sample was the entire province of Ontario. So that's not really a biased sample.
Yeah.
Everyone. And he says, well, what about the people that couldn't afford healthcare? And well, this is the entire province. And you know, we know that it's a very small percent, even among the homeless population, that would not have that. So anyway, we looked at 3 groups and incidents of dementia. So we looked at the population of Ontario as a whole. We looked at people who are homeless, but then the other comparator was people at a similar income bracket, like in terms of socioeconomic status, but who had still had housing. And the interesting thing, or if you can call it interesting, the thing that validated what we were seeing, what care providers were saying, service providers were saying, was that indeed the people experiencing homelessness were having higher rates of dementia, particularly at an early age. And just in terms of the numbers, to try to translate it into English, when you were comparing the people who were homeless to the general population, it was in the ballpark of twice as likely. The reason people haven't really looked at it before is dementia is really one of the many illnesses that's age related, right? Like that your risk goes up as you get older. People who are homeless, and we've talked about this before, don't tend to live very long.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, the average life expectancy is before you would expect to see dementia. So we haven't had a really good life expectancy study for a number of years in Canada, but the last time, I have to look up the year, but so definitely over a decade ago. At that time, the life expectancy was around 79 for men, 81 for women, but it was like 46, 47 for people experiencing homelessness. So shocking. People died decades sooner when they're homeless. However, they age faster and they still have a lot of chronic illnesses. So even, and I've mentioned this before, when we've worked with youth, if you look at the number of chronic illnesses, including things like arthritis, that you normally would, I mean, we know young people can have arthritis, but not in these high percentages. You would think you were looking at a geriatric population, lung problems, heart problems, joint problems. And in that study, the people on enrollment were a maximum age of 25. So people age earlier and don't live as long when they're homeless. So what we found was the most marked thing was that earlier age range. So if you were looking at people 55 to 64 and 65 to 74 is where you saw this huge change. When you get over 74, that kind of washes out, but it's probably because there's not many left alive. Right.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't expect to see a larger number in the older age range. So one of the things we talked about is that we think people need to be screened for dementia when they're homeless, even at age 45, rather than use.
How do you screen them? How would you screen them?
There's a number of standardized tests that are used that take only a few minutes.
Mm,
So even an initial screening like that, like even asking people if they're oriented, what day it is, what
yeah.
year it is. Um, like I'm sure people have seen the tests where they draw a clock, things like
Yeah.
that. There's a lot of kind of quick scans, standardized instruments that could be used that normally it wouldn't occur to you to do, say, if someone's 45, 50 years old. But given the very early onset, that might be useful. The other thing, and it links back to what you were saying about the London initiatives and the pulling together of the homeless and health sector. Like this interaction between housing and health and looking really at the importance of housing as a as a health intervention. And I can tell you a couple of the examples, but when we were talking about the reviews, like one of the suggestions were, do we actually have a randomized trial saying that housing would help somebody with dementia on the street, which was kind of amusing because can you imagine ethically? Let's say we went in London and we found 20 people with dementia on the streets. I don't think anyone would consider it ethical if we left 10 there and housed 10 to see the difference. I think we know what the difference would be.
Yeah.
So,
Can I ask you?
yeah,
Can I ask you a question that's a bit from left field?
sure.
I hate to interrupt you because you're saying some good stuff, but probably the lowest point of my life came when I was 19 or 20.
Mm-hmm.
And it was back in 1970. I was in Bangladesh. So that was East Pakistan at the time. And then there was West Pakistan. And they were in a war. And I was in there. And it was very difficult. I caught malaria. I was young. I was healthy. But I caught malaria, which made things very difficult for me. But I suddenly discovered that the lack of place
Yeah.
totally disoriented me. There was nothing that I could look at that I could recognize or understand. Also, sudden changes were very, very difficult for me. But as you're talking now, for whatever reason, that made me think of that
Yeah.
time. And I think of my own times visiting the homeless here. They very much want to stick in the encampment. They very much want to stay in the tent or whatever it is, because out there, it's very difficult to navigate and negotiate. And I presume if you have dementia, that's even more of a challenge. Would that be correct? Is that
Yeah.
a proper
Like I
statement?
can't even imagine how awful. Even though I've talked to people in that situation, it really stretches my imagination to see how
Yeah,
hard. And it's a good point. Like when you're homeless, it's not just about not having a roof over your head. It's about losing everything.
yeah,
You lose privacy. You lose the family album, the dishes that from your grandmother, often your family pets, most of your wardrobe,
yeah,
your ability to store food. In terms of going to
yeah,
your interest. Um, like I've talked to people, who've gotten food, for example, but don't have a can opener.
yeah. Yeah, I see that all the
Yeah,
time. Yeah,
yeah. I'm sure you do. So
yeah,
it's this idea of losing everything, and you think about how disorienting. So, and I can give you two examples of people I spoke to. What one person actually had been recently housed. I'm not going to give anything specific enough that they would be identifiable, but I'll just say this
yeah,
was in a northern community, and had when she was younger, she had had a very brief episode of homelessness, but had been housed for decades. Had a relationship breakup, and ended up homeless, and noticed she was starting to have problems with her memory, her
Mm.
organization, and she was on the street without any place to kind of pin things. Uh,
Yeah.
so she journaled to try to write down what was going on and write notes, constantly write notes to herself
Mm.
to remember, like even where to go on a particular day for lunch. Like
Yeah.
she tried,
Mm.
so she tried to organize herself to replace this memory with this written piece. But then that was becoming increasingly difficult, like even in terms of how that journal was organized or how she could find, or Tuesdays I can go over here for lunch, but what day is it today?
Yeah.
And so she was describing how very difficult it was to cope on the street in this situation. She was able to get a diagnosis, and because of her diagnosis, she was able to be housed. And she said it put her in a very difficult situation because it was a mixed blessing. She didn't think she would have got the housing without the diagnosis, but now she still had to live with the diagnosis. When I met with her the second time, she wanted me to come to her house to show me how she coped, which was like post very similar to other people I've seen with dementias, like post-it notes all over.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, but she said at least I could do that when I was on the street. I couldn't do the post-it notes, right? And like all she could do was the journal. Was
Mm.
the only way, and this was a very bright person, had had good jobs at time, well educated, and she was
Mm.
in this situation. Um, the interview took a couple of hours because she kept, when I'd ask questions, she kept having to refer to her notes, and she asked me to. And actually, we had several people. We had questions such as our housing history, where people have to figure out where they were and where they were before that. And several people have actually asked for a copy of that because it's actually
Mm.
orienting and helping them to understand it. And she was one of the people that did that, and I made her a duplicate copy and she put it in the journal with the other material. The second
Mm.
situation, in a totally different area of the country, was this woman had no history of homelessness, had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and was being supported in the home by two adult children. Um,
Yeah.
and but it was rental. They were living in poverty, had for years. And during the pandemic, what happened was they were initially told that because of some renovations, the landlord was going to put them up in a motel for a month, and that they didn't have to pay for it. Because a number of renovations needed to be made. At the end of the month, they said, "Oh, we've decided to sell the unit." They're already out of the unit. They haven't paid month in the rent in the last month. They weren't sure what their rights were. So
Yeah.
here was this family, the kids and the mother with this situation, and now suddenly having no place to go. Trying to go around, look at places. They spent the next month in a car. So imagine two adult children and a parent with Alzheimer's in a
Yeah.
car. And this is someone who couldn't get dressed or feed herself without that family support, and they're living in a car.
Wow.
So they finally got into a shelter, but they weren't eligible for family shelters because our definition of family in our shelter system, I think if I asked you what's family, you wouldn't say that's an adult with young kids. But if you go to a family shelter, that's essentially, across the country, like that's basically how we
Yeah.
understand family. And some places it's even an adult woman with small kids. Other
Yeah.
configurations don't count. So the problem was the children were male and she was female. They weren't allowed into each other's areas. they could only meet in the common areas, yet this is someone who needs this level of care, didn't trust
Right.
other people to
Yeah.
assist. So we talked to both the kids and the mom, but again, like just imagine anyone in that situation with a parent and trying to cope and living in poverty. But how can we expect people in this situation to live on the street?
Yeah.
So I mean, those are just two examples of the many. We had about 10 examples that we found of the 400. And again, I imagine many people in this situation wouldn't even be able to do an interview. And
Yeah. Cheryl, I'm sure I've read in numerous places that dementia, just in the overall population, is
oh,
increasing.
absolutely,
Is that
yes,
true?
yes, and we expect it
Right.
to continue to increase, particularly with COVID, because one of the and this study we took 2019 was the year, so it was pre-pandemic, because we figured to look at it during the pandemic when so many things were closed down, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
But COVID causes inflammation of major organs, including the brain, which is
Hmm.
related to COVID. So, if anything, we would expect an increase. And I'd already mentioned one of our other analysis where we were finding people who are homeless were also far more likely to get
Yeah.
have COVID and far more likely to have adverse events. The hospitalization rate for someone who is homeless for COVID was 20 times the population.
Mm.
But other risk factors also really impact this group, such as head injury. Uh,
Yeah.
also predisposes people to dementias, and
Yeah.
we find concussions, major head injuries. We routinely ask that, and it's always over half the population, and it's often repeatedly.
Yeah. So let's let's talk then about, say, London, Ontario health has a health and homeless
Mm-hmm.
strategy, and they're working on that. That doesn't cover the majority of homeless. It covers those that have got the most severe difficulties and puts protections and supports around them. That's very important. But I would suspect, Cheryl, that this is even new to many of
Oh, I
those
am sure. Well,
people in
yeah,
that.
yeah,
So what I'm wondering is, so now they're hearing this and they're going, oh my gosh, that's one other thing that we have to look for and watch out for. How do you institutionalize or standardize a pattern of treatment or recognition? What would that look like for groups that are trying to work with
yeah.
homeless people? What do you see as key
Like
planks of that?
one of the things is it's not one size fits all. So we have to. I always say we have to base it on principles, such as housing first,
Mm,
such as harm reduction,
mm,
such as, and both of those, it's taking people where they're at. But sometimes the specific strategies need to alter for subgroups because youth are not going to have the same needs as somebody with
yeah,
Alzheimer's.
yeah,
Our veterans
mhm,
may not have the same needs as families, although our women veterans may have families. We need to be looking at principles, but look at strategies that make sense for the population. We need good assessments, and that's a principle.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And so, good assessments go across the board. What we're suggesting is this is another area that needs to be assessed. Particularly once we get people into their 40s, because it appears that the dementia starts early.
but you also need qualified people to assess, right? That's why the health, bringing the
Absolutely,
health into this whole
absolutely.
homeless is
Yeah,
so vital.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah,
keep in mind that very highly complex group is certainly one of the areas identified, and that really does take a team effort when you have these very highly
yeah.
complex situations. But one of the other subgroups is youth. And that's really where you can also get into prevention, where you can build on the resilience of youth and perhaps not have them in in that situation. So we do have more than what we're starting with around with a few subgroups, but my understanding of the situation is certainly that's a starting point.
Yeah. So I'm hoping we need to do more on this, Cheryl. I think this is so vital. Lots of us understand just in our own families about
Mhm.
dementia, and not just our older parents or whatever. As we are seeing it more and more, but to recognize this within the homeless population is really important. So I would like to do another one with your
Oh, absolutely,
collaborators if we
yes,
can
yeah.
do
So
that.
they can
I think,
walk you through the math in
yeah,
English better than I will.
that's right. But what I'm interested in here is what you're doing is really vital. I think you're one of the most recognized voices in Canada around research around homelessness, if not the most recognized. So I get all of that. But the fact that there would be people out there who say, you know what, these are qualified people. Say, I just don't know if I get into that, right? Or if I agree with that, or if the methodology was right, or whatever it is. I mean, it's going to take more and more talks, not at our
Yeah.
level. I mean, just within citizens, with people like you to do that. But do you find it discouraging when you discover something new like this, and all of a sudden
No,
there is this pushback,
it
or is
was
that
one
just
out of
part of the
five
research community?
reviewers, right? But
Yeah.
and
Okay.
we know it's annoying because, and as I say, it was Richard Booth that had to do most of the work responding to that. He had all of our input, but he
Yeah.
was carrying the burden. But it is but I think it's a reflection of society. I feel very positive about this work. So often, the care providers and the people with lived experience say to us, it's not that they don't know something's going on, it's that they have no evidence that it's going on,
Yeah, that's
right?
very
And
true.
so you can't get
Yeah. And they're professionals at that research
yeah,
level. They need
yeah.
that
Like,
for
how do
sure.
you put in a
Yeah.
program when you know something's going on, but you have no evidence of it? Right?
Yeah.
So I think that I see that a lot of the role that I try to do with my community partners. Who honestly, I couldn't do the work I do without my community partners.
Yeah.
They're all, but part of that reciprocal nature is very sometimes. Well, sometimes it's a different twist. It's like, oh, I didn't realize it was this bad or this particular angle, but it's often things that they've
Yeah.
suggested and that people have lived experience, but they need that evidence in order to come up with appropriate strategies to write that funding to get those resources to deal with the issue.
Yeah. Cheryl, I'm just one of those people out there that doesn't know all that much about all of this, but talking to you gets me intrigued, and it's interesting. But I do think we need to know more about this. So if you don't mind, talk to a couple of your collaborators. Let's have another one of these or 10 of these. I don't care, whatever it takes to get it all out there, because I think it is that important. Dementia is everywhere. I've seen all of that, but I'd never really applied it to the homeless
Yeah.
population or to the youth of the homeless population. So we need to unpack that and explore it more. You into
Oh,
doing that?
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that'd be good. Let's do that. Thank you for this, Cheryl, for all that you do. I mean, you educate us so much about this, but this is a new
Oh,
unfolding
yeah,
field, and I
it
think we
is.
need to
It is.
understand it better.
I always like to have studies where I can be surprised, and I can tell you that I get surprised.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm sure. Thank you for this, Cheryl. Thank you for being so faithful on this program. For community television, I mean, it's getting out to average people. And I think that someone like you, so well recognized, so well rewarded and awarded, that you could sit down and talk with us and help us to understand it better is really important. In fact, you've made that time. I really appreciate it. You deserve all the
Well,
awards you get.
th-
You're just a nurse. You really do.
thank you, Glenn. Okay. Bye.